So I want to welcome everybody to the second of our webinar series for the EU Studies Program Faculty Development Seminar. Today's topic is COVID-19 and related crises, risks, and opportunities for the European project. And our presenter is Dr. Vicki Birchfield, who I'll introduce more fully in just a minute. But just a reminder that the third and final of the webinar series is taking place next Tuesday, November the 3rd, and that is caught in the middle, the EU and US-China Great Power Competition. And our speaker will be Scott Brown from the University of Dundee in UK. I want to remind everybody that this seminar or workshop has been organized for the EU Studies program by the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. And that is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, receives funding from the European Commission through the Erasmus Plus program. And I want to make clear that any of the views expressed today by the speaker are her own and not the views of the European Commission or the European Union. Just want to get that out of the way. Also, I want to please ask any faculty taking part, if you have a camera, please turn your camera on so we can see your face, and that will create the workshop atmosphere that we're striving for here. Students, please, or anybody else viewing, please turn your camera off. When it comes time for questions and answers, you can submit a question verbally by clicking on the raise your hand function, and you'll be called upon. Just remember that you will be recorded, and if you don't want to be recorded, then you can submit a question using the chat function. That's the second option. So with all that out of the way, I want to introduce our speaker for today. That's Dr. Vicki Birchfield. She is a professor in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And currently she's in residence at the European campus of Georgia Tech, Lorraine in Metz, France, where some of us have been before. So she's coming to us today from Metz. She is the director of the Study Abroad program on the European Union and Transatlantic Relations, and co-directs with Alistair Young, the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, which, as we've mentioned, is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Dr. Birchfield received a DES from the Graduate Institute of International Studies at the University of Geneva, Switzerland, and a PhD in political science from the University of Georgia, my alma mater. She is the author of Income Inequality in Capitalist Democracies, The Interplay of Values and Institutions, also co-editor with Alistair Young of Triangular Diplomacy Among the United States, the European Union, and the Russian Federation, Responses to the Crisis in Ukraine, and co-editor with John Duffield of Toward a Common EU Energy Policy, Problems, Progress, and Prospects. Also, she has co-edited with Giovanna Dell'Orto, Reporting at the Southern Borders, Immigration and Public Debates in the U.S. and the EU. Her current book project is The Transatlantic Values Debate and the Quest for Global Leadership, which examines the evolving nature of EU-U.S. relations in an increasingly globalized and unstable world. She's published articles in International Studies Quarterly, the European Journal of Political Research, the Review of International Studies, Globalizations, the Journal of European Public Policy, and the Review of International Political Economy, among other publications. She serves on the editorial boards of the European Journal of International Relations, the Journal of European Integration, and Globalizations. She has been a visiting scholar at Sciences Po in Paris and the University of Bordeaux. And to me, this is the most impressive. In 2013, she was bestowed the honor of Knight of the National Order of Merit by the French government. So I guess it's now Dame Vicki Birchfield, is that it? Congratulations. So anyway, we're very happy to have Dr. Birchfield speaking to us today about the COVID pandemic and the impact of that on the EU and European integration. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. And I think Alistair is going to pull up my slides and advance them for me. Is that correct, Alistair? Jeez. Excuse me for that. Thank you. I've tried to turn everything off. I'm sorry, that's a rocky start. Okay. All right. If we could just go ahead, Michael's already mentioned my title, so if we could just advance to my overview slide. It's really a pleasure to be with you all here from France. I ordinarily would have a class underway, but we have our fall break, so I gave them an opportunity to duck out a bit early. And this allows me to give this talk without a mask on, so it's really nice. It's a nice opportunity, even if it's virtual. So my talk today, I'm going to address the EU's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what I want to do is start with just a bit of context. And, largely that's the fact that this crisis comes on the heels of multiple crises the EU has been confronting for really the entire 21st century. So I'll say a word about that at the beginning. And then I want to just look at the contours of the pandemic in terms of human cost and the socioeconomic repercussions and the divergence across the member states. And third, I'll spend most of my time actually looking at what the EU level responses have been in terms of their capacity, the competence capacity, and various constraints that they face. And then I'll try to offer an early assessment of the impact, both on the performance and what I think is the perception of the EU's handling of the crisis. And then I'll wrap up with maybe some food for thought about the two viruses that the EU is contending with, and I won't give up the ghost, but you'll probably guess it pretty soon. And then wrap up with what I call an abiding truth. And hopefully that will open up the floor for some nice dialogue and interesting discussion. So we'll get started then with the context. Next slide, please, Alistair. So I think first it's important to point out that this pandemic has emerged, as I said, on the heels of recovery from several crises, but largely and most importantly, the Eurozone crisis. And it's left its scars for sure, but it's been 10 years really, 8 or 10 years since the peak of the Eurozone and sovereign debt crisis. And really just in the last couple of years did we see Greece actually enjoying some economic growth and other countries starting to kind of get their feet back on the ground even very recently. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Vivian Schmidt. She's just published a book on the Eurozone crisis, and she's given a talk recently. I wonder if some of you might have tuned in for it at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And she said that when the book was going to press, she had a minute to make one adjustment, and that adjustment was to say, she had said in her book, the Eurozone crisis is the biggest crisis the EU has ever faced until the coronavirus pandemic. And I thought that was quite interesting, and I'll return to something that she raised later on in my talk. The other crisis is, of course, still ongoing, the continued strains from the migration and refugee crisis, which really hit its peak in 2015 with a million refugees on European soil. And the EU is still grappling with this really devastating human tragedy. And of course, we're still dealing with the rancorous Brexit negotiations, which Alistair decrypted for us very ably last week. And I would just say that all of these, or at least these three major crises, have been characterized as existential threats and really have framed the academic debates and scholarship on the EU for at least the past decade. And I think it's really important to call that. So all of the major textbooks, McCormick, Dinan, Nugent, Patterson, all begin these EU textbooks with this, this framing of that the European Union is still in a fundamental or an elemental crisis. And of course, this recalls, you can't say crisis in European Union without recalling Jean Monnet, one of the key architects of the European project, his famous and widely quoted statement that people only accept change when they're faced with necessity and only recognize necessity when a crisis is upon them. And that, of course, has spawned a lot of scholarly debate about whether or not the EU has been in perpetual crisis really since its origins, and that's in fact how it moves forward. But before I move on to the second point, I want to also mention that even though as we look back on the first 2 decades of the 21st century, we should also, and we look at these crises and problems the EU's been grappling with, we should also remember that 2 cataclysmic changes took place that were relatively positive. One is, of course, the single currency going into mass circulation in 2002, and then, of course, Michael Baum is an expert on the Central and Eastern European enlargements, and that happened in 2004. So these were huge changes that had come about in the European Union trajectory, and I think it's important to just kind of remember that. And then the next thing I'll say is really specific to this moment in history and the EU's attempt to respond to this global pandemic is that it's being managed by brand new leadership across the EU institutions following the 2019 European parliamentary elections. And not sure if we can come back to this, but I think the most important thing to say there is that 61% of the MEPs sitting in the parliament now are total rookies. So it's they're not bringing a lot of experience to debating and fighting with the Commission and the Council. So I think that's worth noting. And of course, the inauguration of the first female president of the European Commission, von der Leyen's commission has been characterized, she herself labeled it a geopolitical commission. That's following Juncker's political commission. So the European Union is becoming more and more of a political animal at this community level. Charles Michel, the former Belgian prime minister, now the president of the European Council, said that the council the aim of the Council and the aim of this generation is for the EU to achieve strategic autonomy. So I think those are important buzzwords to keep in mind as we look at what the EU has done so far in managing this pandemic and the hurdles it still faces. And then lastly, I'll just say that the public health and human security crisis that's unfolding is doing so against a backdrop of growing Euroscepticism, though the European parliamentary elections did not result in a huge kind of tidal wave of support for far-right Eurosceptic parties, but I'll come back to this, but they nonetheless, they have not disappeared. And then, of course, the fraying of the transatlantic relationship. For the first time ever, we have an overtly, actively anti-EU president, and I think that is, we'll come back to that because Michael had asked that we touch on, the transatlantic relationship in our seminar discussions as well. So I'll return to that. Okay, so next slide, please. So to touch on the kind of character of this pandemic, at first I had titled this Empirical Contours. What can I say? What are the facts? And so I started thinking about, the deaths, the impact on the public health sector, the macroeconomic impact and other socioeconomic implications and so forth. But as I was researching it, I found that it's very hard to find, up-to-date, authoritative, and also internationally comparable data. Things are changing so quickly. So here, I just want to point out a couple of things. One, in terms of the human cost, obviously this is a worldwide pandemic that has produced I think 41 million cases of the coronavirus and 1 million deaths worldwide, of which about 262,000, almost 263,000 deaths in Europe. But I have to note that figure also includes the European Economic Area and the EU, the UK, which has the highest number of deaths. So it is very much a deadly disease that has taken its toll in terms of loss of human life. And to say a word about the socioeconomic repercussions, just in general, you're all familiar with what the World Bank and other economic organizations have reported. I think the figure that I found across several different sources is that the global GDP is expected to be to contract by 5.2%. And in Europe, though, most of the figures include Europe and Central Asia, that contraction is about 4.7%. So we know that there are lots of facts and figures we can try to assemble to look at what the economic impact is already just 10 months, not even a full year into dealing with this pandemic. But it's most interesting to look at what it's doing to people's lives and livelihoods. And so this chart that you see here, the figure, I know it may not be that easy to read, and I just want to mention that it's a study that is done, and it was compiled by leading economists, and they basically take the most authoritative statistics, labor statistics across Europe, and they used data based on three very different economies: Germany, Spain, and Italy. And what this is, if someone that would be helpful. Thank you.
Sorry. Everybody except Vicki, please mute the microphones.
Yeah, I think Griffin Petty, I think your mic's on.
So what this study has done, and it's been cited by the Commission, and it's also, it was produced by Vox EU and the European Economic Research Team. It's so this figure looks at what the impact of the restrictions and the lockdown, how that has really translated into employment loss. And so they measure it across the essential on your right-hand side is the impact of employment that's been completely forcefully closed. And overall, the EU average of employment there is 10%. And then as it goes across, you see from right to left, you see mostly non-essential, then partly active, and the turquoise color there represents the labor sector or employment sector that has been able to just transition to telework. And then on the far left, you have the essential employment. And so what this figure tells us is that around 10% of the employment has been completely lost, just closed. And the point that these economists make is that the study shows that the measures themselves, even though there was, divergence in the degree of restrictions and lockdown across the EU member states, you still see a great deal of divergence in the labor market because we have very different types of economies. So what they found is that, especially in the southern European countries, but also in Ireland, you have much higher numbers in this, the closed employment sector. And that they also found that the crisis is likely, the crisis and the lockdown measures and measures taken by government is likely to impact much more devastatingly the already vulnerable segments of the population. So this is, economic activity that's related to the hospitality industry, tourism, personal services, but also self-employment and short contractual work. And that the most negative benefit, the most negative effects, in addition to already kind of lower wage workers, that it's also likely to hit women and youth. So that's there's not a lot more that we can say. They're still, trying to see what the impact is on employment. Some of you may have seen the Economist report recently about the difference between, one of the big differences between the United States and the European Union in terms of economic impact is that Europe mostly, or many countries, adopted the German model of furloughing. And so there was a report on that, and that's why you don't see really high unemployment numbers across the European Union, whereas in the United States we saw unemployment go from 3% in April to, I think, up to 14%. Now it's back down to 8% apparently in the last month's figures. At any rate, we know that this has a devastating impact on the economy and in terms of the health sector and human lives. So now let's go to the next slide, please. So given this situation, what can and what has the EU done? And as we look at that question, I think it's first important to remind ourselves of what the EU's capacity or ability to act is. And of course, European level action is guided by what is conferred to the institutions through the treaties. And this is what we refer to as competence. And the competence is basically divided into three areas: exclusive competence, where there's true community level power and a mandate to act. And you notice that's not listed here because public health is really relegated to the two other areas of competence, and that's the shared power, and this is Article 4 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, and where they have the least legal mandate to act, the Article 6, which is supporting competence. I can say more about that, but I think at this point it's just suffice it to say that the member states have really handcuffed the European Union level institutions and have really wanted to, keep public health under their own kind of national purview. That may be changing if Ursula von der Leyen gets her way, but that's a debate that's around the corner. And of course, the legal competence to act in the public health sector alongside EU member states is also subject to two really important principles, the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. And of course, subsidiarity refers to the fact that the EU can only act if and insofar as the objective of a proposed action can be more competently achieved at the EU level and efficiently achieved. And proportionality is, of course, the content and the scope of any EU action cannot go beyond what is necessary to achieve that particular objective. And if you've read any of the documents from the Commission or the Council, you see references, to these principles. So the legal competence and mandate to act to deal with the public health crisis such as COVID-19 is also abetted by the capacity. So what is the institutional capacity given these relatively strict limitations on its action? Most of that comes in the hands of the Commission, though the Commission, as we all know, throws money at things. And that's maybe their biggest power in some ways, but they don't have a health security budget at all. So everything, and of course everything that they've been able to do is rightfully so, subject to approval by the European Parliament and of course the member states and the Council. Other institutions that are important are I didn't list this here, but the European Investment Fund, the European Investment Bank, and the European Central Bank. And they have been given quite increasing areas of responsibility to act, and some of this accrued to them after the Eurozone crisis, but it seems their powers seem to be consolidating, particularly in terms of quantitative easing. And then the other two, you may not be familiar with this, but the European Union has had a European Center for Disease Control for 16 years now, I think. But it's very much an advisory body, and if you've read anything about their involvement in helping the EU institutions and member states, it's very limited also in what it can do because it is really only an advisory body and it has a staff of only 300. The other one, the European Medicines Agency, is also just has been around since 1995. I didn't realize it had been around quite that long, but their role is really to evaluate medicines and to not replace member states' regulatory authority in that domain, but to help coordinate and harmonize evaluations. And so they're mostly involved now in trying to expedite the development of vaccines and coordinate that. So we'll come back to it. And of course, the constraints are the member states themselves, which, at this point, we'll see if it changes. It changes the thinking amongst the member states that they really do need to move toward a health security union or a health union, as the Commission is talking up these days. But there are 27 member states that have to agree on that, and so we'll see. And of course, compliance, and this certainly came up when we're going to look at issues with Schengen, but also trying to coordinate their quarantine measures and other things. And then, as with everything, it's all shaped by political volition, political will of the actors at all levels. Next slide, please, and I'll go quickly here. This is straight from the Commission when Commissioner von der Leyen organized her response team. They organized their response mechanism around these three pillars: medical, mobility, and the economy. And I think you'll see that when I go over the timeline. So we'll just move to the next slide, please, Alistair. And this is also from the website. I do want to spend a moment looking at this, because then I'm going to go over a timeline that I put together, pulling out some of the most important actions the EU has taken. But if you look at this, I mean, they on the right-hand side, they're starting with flexible state aid rules. I mean, the EU, if anything, it has exclusive competence in the area of competition policy and commercial policy. And state aid has been an area that they have been really strict about, but they've completely relaxed their standards. And I'll say more about that, to just allow member state governments to spend to protect their industry and workers and so forth. medical equipment and procurement is another area, and then they've been issuing guidelines on various measures, and those are getting more and more coordinated. Thankfully, now that we're in a second surge, or ensuring the flow of goods and workers through the single market, looking at using investment, the European Investment Fund. Repatriation of EU citizens, supporting research on vaccines, and relaxing the growth and stability mechanism to allow for spending that would not be in conformity with EU rules. Okay, so the next slide is, if you'll go to the next slide, this is a timeline that I compiled, culling information mostly from the Commission's timeline, which if you print out their timeline, it's 55 pages. 55 pages. And so what I tried to do, I also consulted both the European Central Bank has a timeline, but more importantly, the European Parliament. So what I've done here is just try to pull out what I think are the most important actions and maybe unprecedented actions that the EU has taken. Not all of them, but some are quite unprecedented. And so I'll try to spend my time talking about the most important ones. So also in the interest of time, I'll just, I won't mention every single time point, but just, starting in January with the first death that was reported in France, in January the 24th, that had actually been preceded by the activation of the early warning response system that's coordinated by DG's Health, Safety. And then I have a little icon here of the European passport. And this is interesting because the European Union Civil Protection Mechanism was activated pretty early, but you'll see that they really got more involved in that in April when they brought home more than 500,000 EU citizens from abroad. But as early as January the 28th, they kind of invoked the European Civil Protection Mechanism. And I'm not sure if you know much about that, but it was just an attempt that's also been around since 2001. And it's an attempt to try to pool resources and to be sure that the EU can respond to various disasters and other crises. So to activate it in this way is interesting because it really brought home, if you saw interviews with European citizens who were stranded, it really gave them a sense of the EU, what it really means to have an EU passport, because they could rely on this repatriation, not just from their own national government, but this pooled effort. And the European Commission finances about 75% of those costs along with the member states. So that's where you see this border. I realize you can't see my cursor, or I'm not sure if you can. Can you see my cursor? Yes? Okay.
I'm sorry, Vicki. Yes, we can.
Okay. I wasn't sure. So just to speed up, I've already said something about the state aid measures. Again, I think this is really historic that they have, kind of activated this exception to the rules. They, pushed through a banking package to make sure that loans would be low interest loans and easy credit for households and businesses. All this time, the EU is also beginning to share data. And, the EU, as you all know, at first really fumbled. I mean, that was probably the most common word used to describe every article about the EU. And it was really, for those of us who believe that this is an interesting transnational political experiment that has capacity that no single country has and no other region has, it was embarrassing that they weren't able to, they have this borderless area, why did borders get erected without any consultation or coordination? So it was a rough start, but I think it's important to see how they've learned and where they are now, and all of the actions that were underway. So yes, the border closing was a rude awakening for a lot of especially frontier areas like here in Metz. 30,000 people from France go to Luxembourg every day to work. There were lots of reports from the Belgian-French border and so forth. So it was quite negative. But as we know, the EU was able to act to make sure that borders remained open for the movement of goods, so that they created these green lanes to make sure that goods could travel freely and unobstructed, even though borders were up across the Schengen space. The big thing that I want to talk about here is obviously the May 27th, the announcement of the supposedly Hamiltonian moment. We'll come back. I put Hamilton's face in July 21 because it was just, the May 27th announcement of this recovery plan, the Next Generation EU, to fold their recovery plan and stimulus package, if you will, into the ongoing negotiations for their 7-year financial framework, introduced the idea that for the first time, they would try to, go to markets for investment. So it was an inch towards the mutualization of debt and a fiscal union. And so Macron, when he became president of France, that was a big agenda item for him, but Merkel was very, very tepid. And the Germans were quite opposed to, anything approximating Macron's vision. But the Germans came around, I think, with Merkel's leadership. But of course, everything was on the line until, the member states could more or less sign off on it, at least in principle. And that was the 4-day round-the-clock European Union summit that took place in July. And so I have Alexander Hamilton's face here with the big question mark underneath, because a lot of people suggested that that was hyperbolic. And first of all, it hasn't really happened yet, and I'll get into the weeds of that in a moment. But the question remains whether or not the recovery package will actually be approved. So we did get the approval of the famous Frugal Four. I can't say anything about the recovery package without mentioning the Frugal Four. So those were the countries that were very dubious about this, because the package included a huge amount of loans, and way more significant than, say, the Marshall Plan had been. And so the Frugal Four were those more fiscally conservative countries like the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, and Austria. And they were mostly, especially Mark Rutte of the Netherlands, mostly concerned about the lack of reforms in some of the southern member states. So it brought back really painful and ugly memories of the stereotypes and the kind of the moral superiority posturing that took place during the height of the Eurozone crisis. So that was a pretty rocky period, but as you know, it was pronounced by the media as a landmark agreement. We'll come back to that. By August, the Commission had gotten really active in terms of negotiating on behalf of all the member states with pharmaceutical companies to have access to a vaccine. I should just backtrack and say that the EU also did not give up its kind of commitment to making sure that this pandemic does not hit the developing countries harder, and they had a massive pledging campaign which raised a total of about $15 billion. They did that with other organizations, also especially the Gates Foundation, but an organization called Global Citizenship, a Global Citizen. Just trying to speed up here, the European Parliament last month approved the the own resources mechanism to allow the Commission to start borrowing on open capital markets. And this is really important, and it's something that is now hung up in the kind of, I guess, the conciliation committee between the Council and the Parliament. They're hammering out the details. And so if before it was the concern of the Frugal Four that others would be irresponsible with their grants and loans, the new issue now, and especially coming from the Parliament, was to impose the rule of law conditionality, particularly on Poland, countries like Poland and Hungary. So we'll come back to that issue. And then some of the last actions that have been taken is the interoperability gateway to try to coordinate the contact tracing. But there are only about 6 countries who have brought that online, but they're trying to coordinate that so that contact tracing. And they've also come up, I actually didn't mention this, but they've come up with a color scheme now to coordinate their travel advisories and restrictions. I can say more about that in the Q&A if anybody wants to discuss it. And then the SURE social bonds, $17 billion. And this is to ensure money for unemployment compensation, and just mostly to protect workers. So it's social bonds. Okay, next slide. And I know I've got to kind of move quickly. This is the numbers, and I just want to draw your attention to the fact that originally they wanted about 500 of the 750 billion. The original proposal was to make about 500 of that just grants, and 250 loans. And now it's because of the negotiations, it doesn't. And the Parliament is particularly upset about that, but they've been willing to concede if the Council will be strict on the rule of law conditionality. Okay, next slide, please. This is just a quote. I think it's important to recognize the, I think, really strong, powerful moral leadership of von der Leyen. I don't know if you've watched her State of the Union address or any of her speeches, but I think she's really genuinely committed to making sure that this recovery package is equitable and inclusive, but also that they don't forget that the new financial framework was really all about prioritizing 2 things, the European Green Deal and the digital transition. So I'll just, I think you've had a moment to look at that. I'll just ask Alistair to advance the slides. That was a kind of a whirlwind of a lot of action items that the European Union has engaged in. And I think they've come a long way since out of the starting block, really stumbling badly. But of course, the spotlight is on them again with this wrangling over, the rule of law conditionality. So I think if we kind of try to get an overall assessment at this point, the risk, if we look at this in terms of risk and opportunities, and I think this flows well from von der Leyen's message, it really can be an opportunity for deeper, I'm going to discuss the opportunities first, deeper integration, perhaps moving towards a health union, really moving some of the policies up to the EU level as they see this is a cross-border virus, and they are supposed to be a borderless, economic and social entity. So they really, I think, have learned some lessons and want to use the Digital Services Act and their Green Deal to incorporate these aims and goals into the new budget and the recovery package. Obviously, I mentioned a few things. I didn't draw your attention to how much aid has been given to refugees, but that has certainly been a big part of what the EU has done. Again, supplying aid and financial assistance to countries from Uganda and Gambia to Ecuador. Also, not only money, but the humanitarian air bridge, sending EU medical staff to other areas that are really facing a difficult situation. So I think that lastly, I would just sum it up by saying this is an opportunity to reshape the narrative of the EU and its future. It's a moment to seize. Supposedly, there's going to be a new conference on the future of Europe, and they are talking about that starting next year. So it's an opportunity to seize. If we look at this in terms of the risk, obviously, as President Macron has said on several occasions, I mean, it was the near death of Schengen, and this is after already the near death of Schengen because of the migration and refugee crisis. So I think the Schengen, the integrity of Schengen is really in some ways at risk, and we'll see how the EU performs, how the EU and its member states perform as we are heading into this second area of really probably strict lockdowns. So we have a test really in the coming weeks. Economic decline and unsustainable debt. I mean, for the first time, the European Commission itself can become indebted. So I think that's something to watch. Institutional paralysis, we always have this. This is, mostly playing out right now between the Commission, I mean, not the Commission, but the Council and the Parliament. And then just the continued erosion of trust, and we'll look at that when I look at the perceptions of the EU performance. So next slide, and I'll just wrap up very quickly. So really, I think these risks and opportunities, it's a glass half empty or half full. I mean, what do you perceive? Some people perceive it as an opportunity, like many of the EU leaders. Others see this as a pretty depressing moment for European integration, the integration trajectory. The twin engine is back. I think that is positive. From the very origins, the architects of the European project knew that French-German partnership and consensus and compromise would be key to moving forward. This has been characterized as the European Union's Hamiltonian moment. We can come back to that during the Q&A. But on the right-hand side, I have a picture that is of Viktor Orban of Hungary, who has really wreaked a lot of havoc inside the European Union, not the least of which is the prestige and reputation of a union that's based on values, democratic values, human rights, the rule of law, and so forth. And he flaunts that by being proud to say that he's a fan of illiberal democracy. I'm sure you've seen the Freedom House has kind of reclassified Hungary as a fledgling democracy. We can, and of course, Poland and Hungary are in cahoots here in the context of council voting to try to protect themselves from the invocation of the infringement procedure, though it has already been invoked. So we'll see how that continues to play out. And then just on a more positive note, next slide, a contrast to what's happening with this infighting is just to draw your attention to the fact that we have really powerful female leaders. This past summer, with my study abroad students in the halls of the Commission, we took a snap of hashtag the future is female. And I think we really have to recognize that Christine Lagarde is a powerful and very well-regarded leader. She also made a misstep early on, but she certainly came around, and this might be characterized as her Mario Draghi moment. Do anything, we'll do anything it takes to save the euro. But also I wanted to point out Commissioner Vestager, because this week, I think Thursday, she's going to give a press conference and begin to roll out the Digital Services Act. And I think her quote is really important because she taps into what the real power of the European Union is, and that's its strong economic and market power. Next slide. I didn't want to not touch on some comparisons with the with the United States. I think in the interest of time, I have to just maybe move ahead. I don't know how much time I have, because I don't think I started right at noon your time. But do I have 5 minutes or 3? Somebody want to police me there, Alistair?
I think you can take what you need, Vicki. That's fine. Go ahead and finish up.
Well, Alistair will say you should never tell me that, but this, I think, it's interesting to look at. I mean, yes, we can kind of compare the, the overall human cost, the loss of lives, and so forth. And I've got facts and figures here in my notes. But what you see, and actually that's the next slide, we'll come back to that, but what you see here is where the EU is now heading into this second wave. But if you study this is on Statistica, but it's drawn from the incredible resource that has been the Johns Hopkins University. And you see that the EU really did flatten its curve in the summer. And it's not certain that ever happened in the United States. And so it's very difficult to say, but what we do know about the US is that comparatively speaking and controlling for population, they have had if not the number one, they're in the top 3 of countries in terms of loss of life due to the pandemic. So the next slide will also touch on that, but I think it's interesting to say something. I don't have a graph here, but just something about the comparative stimulus action. The United States, what I've seen based on several sources, but I think it was the World Bank, but also Forbes magazine, says that the U.S. has spent about 13% of its global GDP. And in the EU, that's very difficult to assess, but if you look just at the recovery package, that's 3% of EU GDP. And then if you break that down by a country, France, for example, has spent about 9%, Germany almost 11%, Sweden 12%, Spain and Italy somewhere between 5 and 7%. So a lot of money is being thrown at this problem on both sides. So now I just would like to take a look at, how the public, how citizens across the Atlantic are viewing leadership. This graph is from 538, and it suggests that about 57% of American citizens disapprove of Trump's response, and 39.7% approve. However, that varies when you break it down by in a partisan way. 82.2% of Republicans actually give President Trump a good score for how he is managing the coronavirus, and only 7.1% of Democrats. Now, in terms of the EU, a new Eurobarometer was released just a few days ago, and this is based on surveys conducted in July and August. And this asked, how satisfied are citizens with measures taken by the EU to fight COVID-19? And it's not great. On average, it's 45%. Think that the EU has done, they're satisfied with the job. And that really varies across, and that's what you cannot read on this graph, but you can consult on your own. That really varies, and you might be surprised to learn that Ireland has the highest approval or satisfaction rating for the EU, with 71% of Irish respondents saying that they're satisfied with the EU's measures. And you probably will not find it terribly surprising to learn that the country that is least satisfied is France, with only 33%. But Italy, Spain, the Czech Republic all give fairly low scores. However, on the positive front, this report shows that overall, Europeans do have confidence and trust that the EU is making the right decisions. So 62% say they trust the EU to make the right decisions. That's in general, in the future. And 60% remain fairly optimistic. So I think those are really important things that the EU leadership should try to capitalize on, and as they construct the narrative going forward. And so I'll just end with this quote from a recent report by Carnegie Europe. The coronavirus pandemic could give birth to a more autonomous strategic EU, but the bloc must resolve its internal tensions and find its place in an increasingly fragmented world. And my last slide, just basically, I want to raise a question about, whether or not you think this crisis will be transformed ultimately into an opportunity for more progress and deeper integration across many different policy areas. But it's important to recognize that this virus, I call it, there are two viruses, and I struggled with, do I call this nationalism? I didn't want to call it nationalism. Nationalist populism or populist nationalism. You see both terms. And I guess what I would say is that, I mentioned the parliamentary elections not being as big a success for far-right Eurosceptic parties as we thought. But it did mark or maybe signal the arrival of a truly pan-European populist right. And there was an interesting article by Ivan Kristov. Sure, I'm not pronouncing his name correctly. Michael, you can correct me, but his argument is that we should not rest easy. For those of us who are worried about the threat that nationalism continues to pose to the European project, even though the pandemic has not been a real benefit. In fact, the Greek Prime Minister recently went on record as saying that this was really a devastating blow. And I mean, he used evidence of Salvini's defeat in the Italian elections, but just in general that far-right parties are less vocal than they have been. So we have to continue to watch that. In the context of Black Lives Matter and the social unrest in the United States, you often saw this, two viruses that the United States is confronting. And I think it's not that the EU doesn't have its own problems with racism and past colonial grievances and other things, but I really do think that nationalism continues to be the biggest threat to the European project, and it's disconcerting to see how strong it is. And I can say other things during the Q&A, but the last thing I'll end on is just this notion that the European project is a debate. I think scholars of the EU have beat up on the democratic deficit for so long that I think it's important to recognize that the EU is constrained by its constituent parts, which are its member states. And we see that, we're going to see that at every turn, whether it's the recovery package and the budget, and how the rule of law dispute plays out between the institutions and amongst the member states. It's important to recognize that the real democratic legitimacy flows from the fact that the European project has always been a debate. It's a debate across many areas of where, how many policies should rise up to the community level with sharing and pooling of sovereignty and so forth. And so I think we shouldn't forget that, and we'll continue to watch how this debate unfolds in the context of this pandemic, which is quite alarming again here on the continent of Europe. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Vicki, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Okay. Could you expand a little bit on the Commission's role in raising funds for this virus?
Yeah, I'm not really great at it. I've got notes scattered everywhere. So I'll talk about the first thing. The most recent thing that they've done is the SURE. That's what I ended on. So they recently issued a $17 billion initial social bond which is, again, this instrument to help protect jobs and keep people in employment. And so it consists of two different bonds, a 10 billion euro bond that will be due for repayment in 2030, and then a 7 billion due for repayment in 2040. So it really is kind of characterized in the same way. You've seen this, some commentators comparing it to the Marshall Plan. But the difference is the Marshall Plan was strictly a loan that was eventually repaid, and the debate now is that part of this is going to be through grants, and so I'll continue with that. There was really strong investor reaction, and more than 13 times oversubscribed, resulting in quite favorable pricing. So that's the first thing, and I think it's important. This is the first time in history that the Commission itself has issued these bonds on the open market. So that's an unprecedented step. That's about the limit of what I can say. I mean, yeah. For now, I think that's the most important thing.
Okay, my next question is: does the Commission have the competence to do that through the treaties, or how does that come about? Does it have the authority through the treaty to do it?
Yeah, well, it's at this point, I mean, what's important to note is that this mechanism has to be ratified not only by the European Parliament and the Council, but also the national parliaments. So I would just say that that's their mandate will be put to the test by those checks on its powers. Maybe Alistair or Michael want to say more, but it's a really good question, and I think it was part of the reservations in that 4-day summit were over questions like that. It's not well. I'll stop there because I'm really not. This is not a strong suit for me in terms of also what the European Central Bank is doing. But I do know that they're engaging in quantitative easing. And if you ask me to explain quantitative easing, I will also have to go back. I remember in the 2008 financial crisis, in my IPE class, I had to have flashcards. I mean, I just really didn't understand this. But basically, it's printing money. I mean, it's not exactly printing money, but it's someone else can chime in there. It's a difficult concept, but suffice it to say the European Central Bank and the Commission are acting more and more like the central bank is acting more and more like the U.S. Fed, and the Commission is acting like a national government. I mean, they really, on a lot of these fronts, even in terms of the vaccines, coordinating and negotiating on behalf of all the member states. So I do see this is an expansion of power for sure. So you're right to raise the question, and I'm sorry I can't answer it more.
No, that's fine. I'm happy because you have to ask about this question: where does authority come from? Do the states agree with it? Do the institutions have the authority to do such a thing? Because it seems to me that it's a lot of power given to the Commission, to be able to raise funds in that way. Because we know the authority is not there yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting too in that with this rule of law. Maybe I could sneak in a little more comment on the rule of law mechanism, and that is, the Parliament especially wants governments to have. They want this money to be delivered on the condition that some fundamental changes and maybe it's too little, too late. And some people are saying, well, how far will Hungary and Poland go in sticking to their guns? They've recently said that this is unfair, it's politically motivated, that Spain has done some similar judicial reforms and other things, and they've said they're going to establish their own rule of law institute to monitor this, etc. So they're being very aggressive. But other people are saying, look, they want this money, so it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And I think this is happening right now. So we just have to watch that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Ask a question?
Yes. Yeah.
Scott, go ahead.
Hello.
Alistair, you can ask a question, Alistair.
And now you are asking me?
No, we're waiting for Scott.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Hi, Vicki. I was interested on your point about the risks and opportunities. That's not me.
I'm sorry. I don't know why it won't turn off on my computer, but excuse me, Scott.
No worries. On your slide with risks and opportunities, I noted you had the EU's global role under opportunities. I was wondering if you could expand on that and whether you think there are risks for the EU's global role as well, because perhaps you don't agree with me on this, but I was thinking that, if this goes on for a while and more resources are diverted to tackling the pandemic, there'll be less attention and resources on developing the EU's global role further, at least in the short term.
Well, I guess I would say I don't see it as an either or. I mean, the European Union is only going to be as strong as it is economically solvent and solid. So, I guess that's the first way I would come at that. But I would say, we have to see what they're going to do with the budget. If the budget's approved and continuing to transition to in the Green Deal. I mean, there'll continue to be a global leader on climate change and the ecological crisis. And likewise, the Digital Services Act, we'll see how that goes. But I mean, part of this is they want to, I think this is the way they, their values come into play as they spend their money. So they want to tax polluters. More taxation on polluters. Maybe, and the reason I put Vestager's quote up too is also they're also going after the tech giants. So the digital transformation involves also trying to figure out and continue to tax American tech giants, mostly American tech giants. So, I mean, I guess that would be my first stab at your question. But leadership, global leadership is only as strong as followers, right? I mean, if they're not able actually to, get other people on board with their approach to regulating emerging technologies and reining in the power of tech giants, then their moral leadership is mostly in the kind of communication domain. And I think you're probably more interested in power, and I guess I put that also as a lead up for you, which will be so interested to hear what you have to say next week as the EU tries to figure out its way in this geopolitical, economic and political rivalry between China and the EU. So I'll just defer my question until I've heard your talk. I'll come back next week. How about that?
Yeah, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but yeah, this brings up the issue of majority voting in foreign policy, and of course, if the EU is going to play a greater global role, they probably have to be more efficient in their decision making and be able to make decisions in a timely fashion. So this ties in maybe with the whole discussion of the Commission's expanding powers and the ECB's and the maybe expanding competences of the EU. Is this another area in which we're seeing this maybe as an offshoot of the crisis, the EU beginning to expand its powers and its role somewhat? If there is a significant attempt to introduce majority voting in foreign policy. maybe that's a question for next week's.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good one, but yeah, that's repeatedly come up in in many parliamentary debates too. And interestingly, there's a very good Charlemagne, the Charlemagne column in The Economist this week is actually referring to the Parliament's power. And, really it's going to come down to the member states, are the member states willing to give up veto power? But the Parliament, because its powers have increased as well with each treaty, and they do get to sign off now on certainly trade deals, but other international treaties. The debate is happening at all levels, and so I think it all comes down to the political will of the member states. And I will reserve comment on. I don't think that's going to be a change we see too soon, though it is something that Macron and maybe even Merkel will get behind. But I'm not sure about some of the other players. But this could be an opportunity with Britain, with the UK out of the picture. It would probably never fly if the UK were still inside. So there may be an opportunity there. But again, it's a debate, right? Is this something that member states and citizens want?
I think
in that vein, you mentioned Ivan Krastev, and I assigned my students. Yeah, I think that's it. But I assigned. I'm teaching a class on the EU this fall, and some of my students are watching. But I assigned for them to read for today's discussion, actually, a policy brief by Krastev and Leonard from back in June, in which they based on a survey of European citizens, they conclude that the largest group of people they surveyed desire a stronger form of European sovereignty, a stronger Europe that can advance the EU's interests globally and protect more. And this seems to be an outcome of the pandemic. This shift in popular opinion, not so much in favor of returning to the traditional nation state, but a European statehood or sovereignty that can protect Europe's interests more strongly. I don't know if that opinion's shifted since then, perhaps in response to what's happened since then, but that seems to be, one potential outcome of this crisis is that stronger popular support for that kind of stronger Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I don't know if there was a question there, but I could just.
No.
I think that if you look at the survey data, citizens consistently say that they want more. They want more EU action. They did on the migration, refugee, but it's all that's just an opinion poll, right? And then when it comes down to real action, do they want to take more refugees in? 80% said they wanted more EU coordination and action, but our citizens, and there was evidence of citizens actually being more generous and welcoming than their leaders. So there are lots of examples of that kind of action. But I guess your data or the survey data that you referred to from that piece is consistent in this newly released Eurobarometer report, that it seems to suggest that European citizens do want more. And we have a little bit of positive news in that more, the EU parliamentary elections every single year had declined, but in 2019 it went up. Not by much, but at least it doesn't continue this decline. And the conference on the future of Europe is this opportunity. And if they don't, I hope they will not squander this. But if I could add, I don't know if there are other questions. I think Alistair had a question, but it's interesting to look at just how interlinked all of these issues are, and also what's happening, how they're looking at the U.S. presidential election. Some of you may have read the piece about Boris Johnson really kind of waiting. Alistair, you might have mentioned this in your talk, waiting to see, is he going to go for a no deal? He's more likely to go for no deal if Trump is reelected, right? And that really says a lot about the extent to which, there is this transatlantic mirror out there, kind of watching to see what the developments are. I can tell you that the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's group, her deputy, he has a seat in the European Parliament, the Identity and Democracy group. They're leaving for the United States on October the 31st, hoping to, be welcomed by the second Trump administration and other members of Congress. So, it's really interesting to look at this effect of what's happening in both, domestic politics across Europe and how it's resonating, how political leaders are watching, political leaders and party leaders are seeing. And most, I'll just be candid. Most people are hoping that it's going to be a turnaround, that it will not continue this, kind of America's retreat into, kind of America first nationalist foreign policy. So it's an interesting moment for Europe, to kind of come into its own. And I'm sure Scott will help us, understand that better as we look at how the EU is maneuvering in this, new geopolitical rivalry between China and on that front, they have not coordinated, there's very different positions on 5G, with certain EU member states saying, no way, it's a security risk, and others saying, no, we're allowing Huawei to be a major vendor. So
there's a comment thanking you for highlighting the role of female leadership and sort of raising the question about differences in the response to the pandemic from male and female leadership. That kind of provokes a question for me, which actually Cameron was asking, is the French seem particularly grumpy. They're really pissed off with Macron. They're pissed off with the Europeans. Why are the French so unhappy with the response?
With the response to the virus, or just Macron's leadership?
Well, this was more in the context of the response to the virus. Yeah.
Well, you have to recognize that from the very beginning, there was like a nanosecond of the French public being relatively, even neutral on Macron. To the rest of the world, Macron looks like a smart, intelligent, savvy, reasonable leader. But, very early on across different parties, he was the president of the rich. He was another neoliberal. So from the very beginning, the French have been very skeptical. Just surprisingly so. And they didn't like at all the military language, because Macron came out and, when they set up a military makeshift hospital actually in this region, in the Grand Est region, the citizenry just really did not like that at all. They felt it was posturing, and so now, he's experienced a change of government after the local election. So he's fragile in some ways, right? It's somewhat, he's protected, he's insulated because it's a presidential system. Parliamentary presidential system. So the French are just, it's just I don't want to say it's a pathology, but it's certainly, it's a persistent trend that the French are never satisfied with their leaders. And it's very hard to point to an era where presidents were well liked. Chirac had his moment, Mitterrand had his moment, but they both ended in very unfavorable public opinion. So I think that it's a political cultural phenomenon that's maybe in their DNA to protest and rebel, but they also, I will say Macron enjoyed a little bit of a bump. You know, he kind of learned his lessons. His second address to the nation, his tone was different, but he's about to give another address probably tomorrow. They've had 2 back-to-back meetings, and so you know, it'll be interesting to see if. But right now, I mean, it's not as bad as you guys have seen the violence in Italy. You know, the Italians protesting against new lockdown measures. And I don't think we'll see that in France because, I mean, I have to mention this, it's off topic, but you guys know about the gruesome beheading that took place here. So it's just, you know, the country is just kind of demoralized, really. And if I just squeeze in one other thing, Alistair, as you know, right before, well, you know, before coronavirus, there was, you know, Macron trying to push through pretty tough economic reforms, including, you know, retirement. And so the Gilets Jaunes movement did not produce the results that many people on the left wanted. And then they were kind of muzzled, you know, with the lockdown. So it's, you know, they're an interesting public to watch in terms of political culture, but it's frustrating because they do have, you know, a really strong European leader in Macron now, and it's a shame, but we'll see. They do like the education minister, and the prime minister is getting pretty favorable views as well.
Just sort of returning to the broader theme of the talk, there are a couple of, I guess, questions that I'd like that were in your talk that I'd kind of like to emphasize and underline and so one of them is the broader question that's been around for a while, is what is the appropriate yardstick for evaluating the effectiveness of the EU's response to a crisis. And it's never articulated. People are, you know, you often get the EU bemoaned for being slow, but there's no appreciation, as you were sort of talking about, the constraints of the member states. And I keep trying to tell my students that the EU, like the US federal system, is meant to be inefficient. The center is meant to be weak, right? So, and if you don't take that into consideration when, you know, thinking of what is an appropriate yardstick, how good could the EU have done reasonably, and then compare it to that. So that's one question that sort of comes, you know, this crisis is provoking again, and I would say the EU has handled this crisis better than it did the Eurozone crisis. But that also leads to another question, because in the response to the Eurozone crisis, there's all of this literature about how the Eurozone crisis reflects a shift in the balance of power between the supranational and the intergovernmental decision-making, where, you know, it was Eurozone crisis was very much seen as being managed by the Eurogroup and the European Council. And, you know, it sort of seems though in this crisis, the Commission has, and the central bank, I mean, the ECB was a big player in the Eurozone crisis, obviously, but it was slower, right? And this time you see the Commission and the ECB kind of out in front. So I was just wondering, you know, how you might think of this plays into that supranational intergovernmental discussion around the EU.
Well, thanks for the question. I think on the yardstick and, you know, how we evaluate the EU's performance, I mean, I think it really has to be in comparison with other countries in this context. And that's what makes it, I agree with you. I think it has done a lot, and it's, you know, taken really, you know, unprecedented measures when it comes to the economic, you know, package. But ultimately, when you think of its resources, when you think of it, you know, the fact that it has, you know, the Schengen area, it's supposed to, it had all of the mechanisms, if you will, to do better, right? And initially they didn't. And I think that's, you know, but I do feel like they learned quickly. And I think that, you know, von der Leyen especially, I think, has been really good in, constantly consulting, and the Parliament has been engaged. The Parliament released a whole report. I think they're working quite well with the Commission. So in a way, it's kind of the Commission and the Parliament against the member states. In terms of the intergovernmental and supranational logics, I actually read, somebody sent me a nice piece that I can send you, because what I will say from it was in the Guardian. What I recall from it is that, Margaret Thatcher, when she gave her famous speech at the College of Europe in Bruges, it was all about, the intergovernmental logic and, protection of member states' sovereignty and so forth. And this journalist referenced Merkel's speech 10 years ago at the College of Europe, where she said, we have to face this, and we have to face this dilemma between these two logics. And she actually referred to as ideologies of intergovernmentalism and supranationalism. And I think that's why I think it's important to go back to those debates, and to recognize there were some serious mistakes made, and that cost the democratic legitimacy of the EU during the management of the Eurozone crisis. Right? And governments fell because of it too, because there was such, pressure on the Greek government, and they tried to be tough, and then they turned it to their voters, and their voters said, you caved, right? And accepted these technocratic, austerity measures. And so it's a difficult tango of a dance between kind of what the elites and the public want in terms of, what they expect. Going back to Michael's reference to the surveys, Europeans constantly say that they want more Europe. So it's the national leaders that have to tune into that, right? And so leaders in the European Parliament and in the Commission have to try to force that narrative and that onto national leaders, because we don't have harmonization of political elections, and domestic politics are unfolding in different ways. And so how can we harmonize the spirit of European citizenry, more or less, stronger support for maybe some areas that can, move towards greater supranationalism. So it's a tricky, it's a debate. It's a constant debate, and it's a debate that's happening amongst elites and in the public. And I think it's that mismatch, as you know, I'm really interested in trying to look at what's happening in terms of the mismatch between elite views and perspectives and public perceptions and preferences. And I think we, until we start to see some kind of reconciliation between the elite and mass, or public, we're not going to get much progress. And I think that's what the future of Europe, this new conference, will be about. And I don't know if you all remember the last one, the future of Europe conference that took place in the early 2000 for 18 months. And I hope they do a better job with the public diplomacy and the communication. And more citizen engagement in that process. And I think that's very important to get that, more citizen engagement in the European level debates.
Okay, well, that's maybe a good way to end it. We're about out of time. I personally have lots of questions I could ask you, but I think we'll have to do that another time. Thank you, Vicki, for very enlightening, informative discussion, and I think we all learned a lot. Brings us up to date with what's going on in Europe as far as the coronavirus response and its impact on the EU and European integration. Looking forward to the future. So. We'll keep our eyes on things and see how they go. But thank you, and I want to remind everybody we have one more webinar next Tuesday, and that's going to be on geopolitics and the U.S.-China relationship and where the EU fits in with all of that. And that should be a very good one as well. But thanks to everybody. Thank you, Alistair, once again for coordinating everything.
Thanks, Vicki.
Thank
Vicki,
you.
good luck in Metz.
Good job. Excellent.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Vicki.
Bye.
Hi, thanks.
Yes.